eBay made a positive change this week, but did they go far enough? I don't think so. The change relates to listing items in the parts or repair condition. Anytime I sell parts for parts or repair, I don't want them back. I want buyers to read the description, make an informed decision, ask questions, which they're invited to do, and then stand by their decision. When I order an item and it's my mistake, I don't expect to send that item back. If I order an item and the seller made a mistake, I then expect the seller to take it back. But that's a personal view, and as you set up your business policies, you will have to make similar decisions. I'm Brian. We're at the lake. We're going to talk about this change. So, as I mentioned, John did a little video mentioning that the change had come online. They had promised it in October, and they did it. Basically, they made the change to a condition code. Condition codes are like new open box, used. In some categories, there's half a dozen codes. When you look at the media category, it starts at new, like new, moves down to very good, good, and finally acceptable. So they're giving you a half a dozen choices. Now, I wish eBay would expand all the categories into more choices. A lot of them are just new and used. And that, especially when you're selling incomplete parts, parts that need repair, you're selling parts that other people might be able to harvest or restore, it becomes an important factor. Because not all the categories have the choice of saying this item is for parts and repair. I probably sell about 5% of the items have either been parts harvested or are units with flaws. Because the truth of the matter is that not everything that's worn or inoperative is worthless. I'm going to give you some examples as we go along. I'll pull some screenshots from my own listings and I'll use it to reinforce where I'm going with this. So eBay introduced the change. What there is now is when somebody buys one of your items that you've coded parts and repair and you've said no return, a pop-up will appear telling them they have to acknowledge with an additional click that they understand that it's a parts and repair item and they're not going to be able to return it the way they used to. Or one of the things about this policy change is that it will reduce the time in which a buyer can open that claim, can put out that INAD, request that refund or return at your expense, because he's now got a 3-day window instead of the old 30-day window. And the thing about all those INADs, returns, refunds, cancellations after ordering, they all consume your time. And often they can consume your product. But we'll get into that. eBay's constantly trying to work on this issue. And in the 20-odd years we've been reselling, the whole balance between buyers and sellers and claims has tended to go towards the buyer side of the seesaw. So sellers are always looking for additional protection. And this is a good move toward that. But I don't think it's sufficient. And here's why. If you've got a category, and I'll use a transformer toy as an example. If you open up that category or subcategory, you only have 2 choices, new and used. Well, if it's an electronic toy and the voice, the sound box doesn't work, it's not new, obviously, it's out of the package. But you can't just say used and then explain it in the narrative, in the item specifics and in the description, because a lot of buyers don't read. They don't read your notes. You can say it in several places, and I'll show you this as an example. And you still get buyers who say, oh, I never read that. I'm using my smartphone, so I didn't see that. You can have a picture showing the broken part. And they say, oh, I only saw the lead photo. I didn't see, So when I do it, I tend to put a note up in the title that says read or in op, and then I put something in the item specifics, same thing. I describe what I know about the error, the fault, the damage, the wear, and then down in the description I get into it a little longer. But all some buyers see is that cheaper price. You know, here's a page of items. They're all very similar. They're all pre-owned. Yours is at 30% of the rest of them, and they snap that up. Some of them buy it and then realize they've made the mistake and they want to get out of it. Others simply intend all along to harvest some parts from your unit that's already defective and then force you through an INAD to take it back. I had that happen with a toy train that had a little steam generator inside, so that as it went down the track, it was supposed to puff smoke. And the unit that did this was buried deep inside. But the guy's claim, of course, was that it was broken. Well, without damaging the outside cosmetic, it didn't happen in shipping, is my opinion. But, of course, eBay said, we can't tell whether the buyer's trying to scam you or not, accept the return. And you have to decide if there's enough value left in the parts and pieces you get back. So a lot of categories only say new and used. There is no option to say parts or repair. I use it when it's there, and when it isn't, then half a dozen places I'll make a statement. I'll show you something. When I say this policy change doesn't go far enough, there's another group of items, and I'd like to see a condition code created for it. I'm talking about new old stock, NOS. If you get, say, a 25-year-old sealed, I guess it'd have to be older than that now, a Sony Walkman. If you get a 30-year-old Sony Walkman, still sealed in the clamshell blister pack, never been opened, never been used, but the batteries have probably died decades ago. But it's a sealed unit. So you're faced with a situation in which you don't want to break the seal to test the batteries. You can't even tell if they're corroded, you can't tell if they're dead, you can't tell if it operates, but it won't operate at full power. You don't know anything except you have a very old sealed unit. And when you open up the category, your choices are new and used. Well, it's not new, it's 25 years old. The packaging may be yellowed, but it's never been opened, so it's not used. So it falls into that gray area. And again, no matter how many times you try to explain that, you as a seller have to decide, do I call it new or do I call it used? Because eBay's only given you two choices. So I would love to see eBay add more categories. It's like when they changed from, used to have new other. You still find new other occasionally in some categories. Many categories change to new open box. Well, what do you do when the item never even had a box? So you're initially misdescribing, and you have no choice because eBay's limited the number of categories. How hard would it really be for eBay to unify it across in any category that they allowed you to sell used items to actually have a staged criteria more like media? You know, media has 6 choices. Why can't most categories have 6 choices? You could have new, new other, new open box. You could say new old stock. You can say used. You can say parts and repair. So why don't they just standardize it, giving a seller more choices? I don't know. It's always bugged me because it causes INADs and it causes confusion. I don't feel right saying an item is new when it's obviously got a 25-year-old packaging date on it and it's sealed. But I don't want to call it used because then all of a sudden my value, my perceived value drops in the eyes of anybody scanning down that page looking for an item. I think only a couple times have I ever had a buyer actually say, I dropped my girlfriend's thing and I need a replacement quick. Please send it. Normally you get the opposite. It arrived broken. Give me a refund. Well, that's always a little frustrating when you sell something, you hear the cha-ching, and then either immediately or shortly thereafter, you get a note from somebody that says, I wish to cancel my order. Well, the first thing I always do is go out in a note and ask for details, because many buyers don't bother saying anything other than changed my mind. Sometimes you get some pretty interesting stories in there about what caused them. Oh, I knew I had one. I couldn't find it. I ordered yours. Then I find it. I don't need two. Please cancel my order. So generally, unless the reason is just completely out there, I immediately cancel, let them process the refund. And I've always thought that, and this is not to say that there are a lot of buyers out here who would do this, but if you refuse to cancel an order, what I've seen happen is when the item arrives, the buyer intentionally does something to the part. Then they can say the item was not as described. It arrived broken. It arrived torn. A seam was ripped if you're selling clothing. There was a crack. I had one time that was a cookie jar, one of the first cookie jars I ever shipped. And the body of the cookie jar, according to the person, was broken. Now I suspect from the correspondence that they had dropped their cookie jar, ordered mine as a replacement, and sent me the photo of their broken one. It's a great way to use eBay to get a free or nearly free part or item, because a lot of sellers, they just simply say, fine, you sent the proof, here's a refund, don't bother shipping back the item. Now here's another situation that relates to this change. If I part out something, and I've got a video up using coffee pots as an example. If I part out a new coffee pot, it arrives new open box, probably a pallet return from a Walmart or an Amazon, and I decide the item has more value selling pieces than the whole unit, because the whole unit might be, this big and too expensive to ship in comparison to where they can go buy it locally. So I decide it's got 10 parts that have enough value to exceed what I paid and produce a nice profit. Coffee pot's never been used. Do I call those parts new? Do I call them used? Or do I call them for parts and repair? Because the part itself is new. The problem is that the manufacturer never offered to sell you that part. They offered to sell you a unit. So there's no coding to say, I took this from a new unit and now you're buying this little piece. So I have to look at condition. It's the same way if it's used. If I take a used coffee part apart, do I have to say the part is used? Well, yes. But if the choice is there to say parts or repair, do I have to use parts or repair? It's not really clear. They leave it up to the seller to decide. And I use the item description block to do that explanation. But the problem again is if the buyer never reads it, or they read it and ignore it, or they read it figuring they'll get the part and then they'll make the decision, and if they open an INAD, you have to pay the return shipping. It's like no risk to them. It's risk to the seller, but there's no real risk to the buyer because eBay will force the INAD. Which brings me to another point. For 20 odd years, bogus INADs have cost sellers. And a lot of people in the industry say, oh, that's the cost of doing business. And reps at eBay all seem to think that you should simply accept the buyer's return regardless of the circumstance. But I'll tell you, they've never really found a way for a seller to object in an individual case to having to pay the shipping on an INAD. It's just one-sided. And they say, oh, well, if it arrives and they've abused it, you can withhold some. Okay. But if they took an item that was sealed in a blister pack and hard to come by because it's a 25-year-old Walkman, and there aren't many of them left sealed in the pack, and they open it and they play it, then they want you to take it back. You can't sell that as new again. Once that package seal is broken, it's a used item. Is 50% enough to cover you for the hassle, the time, the loss of value for the item? No, and I don't have an answer for this one. And I guess eBay doesn't either, because they've never really solved this. They keep changing it over the years, but they've never really solved the problem. I had one the other day. Maybe I'll see if I can find it. Message comes in. It's for a clock part. I got 3 cases of them some time back. Sold all of one model and have almost sold out of the other. Good multi-quantity listing. 2 models. I think I had 10 or 12 each, and I've sold just about all of them. But the guy sends me a note that says, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't fit my clock, can I return it? I went back and said no. I'm selling it as new. I'm describing it, showing the size, stating no returns, and I don't want to take it back once you've opened up your clock, put this in to see if it can work, and then say, oh, it's the wrong one. So he comes back with a message like he's trying to convince me to change my mind, and his message says, oh, I wasn't going to install it. I was just going to pull out the bad one and hold it next to yours and see whether they fit. And then I'd want to return it. And he says, and I need 2. And it's like, well, I'm thinking to myself, I wouldn't think there'd be 2 in one clock. But anyway, the point is I said no. So I in fact cost myself a sale because I did not want to get back a used part, a part used by the buyer for troubleshooting. Because that's often what people do. It's there's an equivalent in the clothing categories where people will buy, if you've got enough inventory that's the same, they'll buy a small, they'll buy a extra small, they'll buy a medium, 3 identical items except for size. And you know when you fill that order that 2 of those are likely to come back because they're size shopping. So they've ordered 3 and they're going to try them all on, maybe get makeup on them, maybe sweat in them, and then 2 of those are going to come back. And some buyers will open an INAD because if they can find a hook to hang that on, you have to then pay the return shipping. They get a great value on that one that fit, and you eat the cost of the other 2. Yes, so it's a passionate topic for me. Now, about the only time I don't cancel an item is if I've already shipped it out. If the buyer's cancellation request comes in after I've put it out in the box, I say no because I don't have it anymore. But I will tell them that if they already know they don't want the part, when it arrives at their end, don't open it. Mark it RTS, return to sender, hand it back to the carrier. And the post office will send it back with nobody paying the extra shipping. I once had a guy open it, decide he didn't want it because it didn't fit. He didn't ask any questions. And he sent it back priority, and I shipped it out first class, and he wanted me to cover the difference. In fact, I think he put it in an overnight priority. So the shipping went from like $4 or $5 to $21. And when the carrier arrived in the driveway, the carrier had a form and the item, and they're like, okay, sign here, you owe us the difference. And I'm like, no, I'm refusing this return. I don't know whatever happened to that item, but I wasn't about to, to pay that extra, I don't know, what is that, $17, $16, because the guy changed his mind and then couldn't put it back and ship it in a reasonable manner. He thought he was being funny. I don't know. He thought he was penalizing me because he was upset. And it's always frustrating when a buyer decision or a buyer oversight then turns into an angry buyer. Because some people always have to blame someone, and you're an easy target. And as long as eBay continues to support those buyers, you will remain an easy target. But luckily, in the 20 odd years we've been doing this, if I get a couple of those a year in the 3 stores, that's about average. In fact, I was cleaning the office out this week, and I came across a recent package that I've been holding because I needed the 30-day window to expire to make sure the buyer couldn't contact me and want something. But I found an old one or two, and they were on a shelf. Same thing. I set them aside, and I don't do anything with them for 30 days. Once I've contacted the buyer and tried to find additional information or instructions from them, and I don't hear back from them, I let a 30-day window expire, and then I deal with it. Well, if it's a multi-quantity listing and I've got more down in the shop that aren't even packed, and this is already all boxed, I don't open it back up. But when I was cleaning the office, I found a couple of these, and I think they'll make a good video on their own. To wrap it up, eBay made a change to parts and repair. They're now telling the buyer they got 3 days to let us know that they're unhappy with the parts and repair. Now that in the pop-up should mean fewer returns and fewer INADs. And I hope so. I hope so, because every time I get a return or an INAD, you've basically lost all the profit from that sale because you've lost the time to deal with it. They announced they were going to do it back in August. John over at Flipping Ain't Easy did a video, first one I've seen on the topic, and it was announced by Liz in Value Added Resource, which is a newsletter for the reselling community. I get a lot of my news updates via Liz, going out through people who make content. That way I don't have to individually go looking for the changes on the different platforms, and that's good.